Hey, everybody, I just wanted to make a quick announcement before we jump into today's episode. We will be taking a short break after episode 14 because episode 14 will wrap up our second season. We're gearing up for an all new season, so be on the lookout for updates on when season 3 will be out, and in the meantime, we will also be dropping some mini-sodes your way. So be sure to check those out. And we also just wanted to take the time to say thank you so much for listening to the show. We truly love each and every one of our fans, and we can't wait to bring you even more amazing stories. Just a warning, this episode may contain language or topics that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
How would you feel if someone was living in your walls, in your house?
Oh, that's a very different type of question. I probably would not feel too great about that.
No? Not a
I'd be
normal thing?
No, I think I'd be super creeped out about that. Get the authorities involved. That's not a normal thing to have somebody living like in the walls of your house.
So if you heard knocking from the walls, or if you heard weird noises when you were sleeping, what would you think was happening?
I mean, I'd probably feel like the house was haunted and I'd get the hell out as soon as possible.
Okay, so then you wouldn't call the cops.
I would probably call the cops after I got out of the house.
Okay. So
Well,
you would think it's supernatural.
Well, I mean, you don't know, right? Like, I mean, my thing is this, right? Like, I'm totally into like investigating horror situations and like scary situations, right? Like haunted houses and those kinds of things. But like knocking from inside the walls is not like a normal thing. I would probably exit my home and call the cops.
Yeah. Well, that happened in a small town in Massachusetts, like a couple decades ago. So this is the case of Danny LaPlante. There were two teenage girls who were sisters in Townsend, Massachusetts. They started hearing things in their walls. One day, they decided to do a seance in order to speak with their dead mother. And the seance worked.
What do you mean it worked?
So they heard knocking from the walls when they would talk. Yeah. When they would call out for their mom.
That's really creepy.
Isn't it? And then they would see things moving from one place to another. Also, like furniture moved.
Oh, like it moved. Like when they left the room, it was moved, and they came back in. It was in a different spot.
Yeah, in a different spot. Maybe the next day or something. Yeah. Yeah. And one day, apparently, items were just like laid on a dining table, and then the next day, they were on the floor.
What?
Yeah.
So obviously, like Danny LaPlante, like did that, right? So he was in the house in the walls.
Yeah, he was in the walls. He would come out of the walls to do whatever he needed to do, and then he would go back into the walls, do the knocking, which became regular. And the girls were just convinced that it was their dead mom talking to them in some way.
Jeez. So, I mean, this sounds like, I don't know, like it sounds so unreal for that to actually happen. Like that doesn't sound real, but it is, right?
Sounds like a horror movie, right? It really is like a horror movie.
It's like a real life horror movie. I mean, a lot of horror movies, right, and things like that are based off of like urban legends and like these sort of like stories with cult followings. It reminds me of what is it? The Boy, which is the doll that would like move, right, and like be in different places throughout the house. And actually, it is pretty similar. In the end, you find out like it's the son, and he does live in the walls of the house.
Oh my God, this is getting worse. And you ask me why I don't watch horror movies.
I
Because they become
mean,
a reality sometimes.
well, I am a horror fanatic, so
She is,
but
guys.
it's it's really interesting. I mean, all of this is really crazy. You know, you can take these stories and turn them into something else, right? You can turn them into like these stories that are larger than life, where, you know, yeah, like they become like the stuff of legend, right? So it's like you take like certain facts, like even with the Danny LaPlante case, right? There's certain facts that like evolved into something else, right? That was a thing with this case, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was incredible how when we were just looking at different articles of the case, the names of the girls were different. The names of the girl's dad was different. One thing that seemed to be constant was actually Danny LaPlante's name.
I think there was even some information where it's, you know, in one place or another where it said that like he dressed up like the mother and stuff like that. But then if you look somewhere else, like reading a completely different article, it doesn't even mention that.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a
Like
little
the
dramatic.
facts. Yeah, I mean, it's the thing. Like, you know, there's drama involved, right? Because it's such a crazy case to begin with, and so that kind of brings us to what today's episode is about. There are a dozen sides to every story, and then there's the truth. Some true crime cases can grow to a cult status and turn into the stuff of legends. Is what we hear always the truth? True crime novelist Joe Turner has been researching the Danny LaPlante case for years. After writing an article on the case, those connected to it in different ways came forward and revealed to him what he got right, what he got wrong, and what he missed entirely.
Thanks, Joe, for being on the podcast today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, why you chose true crime?
Yeah. Well, I'm a British true crime author. I fell into the genre probably about 15 years ago now. It just all started very slowly. I wrote some articles for a couple of websites, like non-paid gigs. And then I gradually just kind of moved through the ranks, and I started working for a few different websites, a few different podcasts. I wrote for some newspapers, and then over the 5 years or so, I managed to turn it into a relatively lucrative career, I guess. And ever since then, I've stayed in the genre, and yeah, still trying to get my head around it all.
What is it about true crime that excites you?
It's a good question.
It's a hard question, right?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's the whole mystery aspect of it. Like, you know, I hate unanswered questions, and I love trying to dig deep enough to find an answer that no one else has ever gotten. There's that kind of aspect to it. And it's because I grew up with like horror movies and stuff like that, like Silence of the Lambs and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and that kind of affected my love for it. I don't think there's any one reason why I'm attracted to it. It's just there's some invisible connection in your head that I can't quite manage to verbalize. But I think it's the whole mystery thing, because like I'm mostly attracted to cases where there's either not an answer or the answer is not fully realized, such as LaPlante. So, because I'm sick of hearing about like Ted Bundy and John Gacy and Richard Ramirez and all that stuff. Like, if I never hear their names again, I'll be perfectly happy. So I'm more interested in the relatively obscure ones where there's details to be unearthed by amateur researchers like myself.
Yeah, I mean, LaPlante's case really is obscure. And I know that you've done a ton of research into it. If you could just give us like an overview of the LaPlante case.
It's a very strange case because it's not like, it's weird because usually in true crime, part of the story that gets the most attention is the murder aspect of it. But with LaPlante, the focus is on something he did before his murders, which is almost unheard of completely in in the realm of true crime, really. So he was born in 1970. He had a kind of violent upbringing. He didn't have a very good childhood, and then by his teenage years, he was like a delinquent. He started fires. He burglarized people's homes, and then he became obsessed with this local girl in his town, the town of Townsend, Massachusetts. And he became obsessed with this girl named Tina. And he started dating Tina for a short while, and then she dumped him, and he didn't take it very well. So Tina carried on living her life. And around her home, she would notice strange things happening. There'd be litter left out that she didn't leave. There'd be noises in the middle of the night. And after sort of 6-8 months of these weird occurrences, she said, there's something weird going on in our house. This is not normal. So they called the police. They checked every corner of the house and couldn't find anyone in there. Police left. The sort of hauntings continue, hauntings in inverted air quotes. The police came back a few days later and they did find a young boy hiding inside her basement. That boy was a kid named Daniel LaPlante, and he'd been living in this house without the residents knowing for nearly a year. So obviously it was a very serious crime. So they sent him to a juvenile psychiatric ward for 9 months. And then when he came out, within a couple of months, he'd gone back to his old ways. He hadn't been rehabilitated at all. And then he went on to murder a local family, a pregnant woman and her 2 children. And then he wasn't a very skilled murderer, so they caught him very quickly. Then he went to jail within a few days, and that's where he remains to this day. That's the cliff notes of the whole story. There's a lot more to it, but that's the overview.
So, you're in England, and this case takes place in Townsend, Massachusetts. Why this case? What got you interested in this specific case?
It was kind of an accident how I fell into it. I remember first hearing about the case like 20 years ago now, back when I was a teenager. I remember there wasn't much details. Well, there still aren't many details about the case today, and there was even less back 20 years ago. And I remember just reading a few lines about it, and it always stuck in the back of my head. I've got a very strange memory, and it's just always stayed with me. And then a few years ago, I was working for a website, and I decided to cover this case because it was kind of obscure, kind of weird. So I thought, that'll be quite interesting to cover in depth. So I got all the resources I could from online resources, and there weren't many. And I put together sort of a comprehensive list of LaPlante's life from start to finish. And I put it out there, and then I thought nothing of it. A couple of weeks later, I was contacted by the officer who arrested Danny. He'd found the article, and he told me his side of the story. And then for the next 3 months or so, I just kept getting message after message from people who knew Danny or grew up with Danny, or they were his teachers, or they owned the shops that Danny burgled, or they were some of his living victims or some of his family. And then I pieced this whole story together just by talking to these people. I had no intention of putting it into any kind of format. So I just talked to these people normally. Sort of became quite clear that what had been reported online was not anywhere near the reality. Everyone I spoke to all thought that their part of the story was the one that had either been embellished or completely omitted. But it turned out that every aspect of the case had been, had some kind of effect like that. So I put it all together, and then it was just completely different than what had been reported. So I thought it was kind of my duty, I guess, to put the whole thing into a coherent format to clear up some of because as you know, the case is full of misconceptions and lies and people just exploiting it for their own views and stuff like that. So I thought I'll put a coherent source out there that people can use to, if they want to retell the story through their own mediums, their podcasts or whatever, then they can use my source to do it, because it's straight from the victims themselves, it's straight from the people involved. There's no embellishments, no lies. And that's pretty much how I fell into it. And of course, the case is interesting enough for me to want to pursue it. I remember when I first heard about the case 20 odd years ago, and I heard about him living in the walls, in air quotes again, and it became like my, I don't want to say obsession, but I think everyone's got a kind of what I call a white whale, like Moby Dick. Everyone's got that one thing that they're going to keep searching for, no matter the obstacles that come in front of them. They'll always pursue this thing that they probably can't get. And for me, it was to find out how Dan pulled this off. How does someone live inside someone's house unknown for a year? And I sort of made it it was always in the back of my head, and I thought I need to find out how he did this. So I think that's what kind of pushed me towards continuing and carrying on and discussing with these victims and stuff like that.
how did he, like, how was he really able to pull that off?
It was it's very anticlimactic, the the explanation. That's another lesson that you chase this white whale for so long and then you find out it's not that great. So he just walked in. He just walked in the house. I was thinking there'd be some kind of contraption, like pulleys and stuff like
Yeah.
that, and how he'd dig underneath the house and come up the other side. He was like, no, he just walked in.
Jeez. Everybody keep your doors and windows locked. That's basically.
Yeah,
Wait, he just walked
exactly.
into the house, but then how did he get into the walls? I clearly don't know anything about construction, but
Well, this house, it's a split level home, so it's on 3 floors. You walk in the front door, you're on the middle level, and you go downstairs. And downstairs they had this huge basement, and there was a door in the basement as well. So he had 2 points of entry if he wanted. So he could either go in the back door or go in the front door, and then just go down to where he wanted to be. And then there was there was like a false wall up against one of the corners, and he just used to slip behind that false wall. So yeah, that's all he did. He just walked in.
That's really creepy.
Very disappointing.
It is anticlimactic, but it's also still
Very
creepy.
much so. Yeah.
I think what's interesting and what's like dramatic and fascinating is that it actually happened. Maybe not in the method in which it happened is exciting, but the boy in the walls, and that's you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any. I think there's like probably about a handful of cases of this ever happening in history. In most cases, it's like squatters living in people's attics and lofts and stuff, but actually living in the same area that the other people are as well. Mostly unheard of. There can't be any more than sort of 10 cases of it ever happening in modern history. But then again, that's another thing that kind of draws people towards it and gets them fascinated, really.
He basically had a daily peep show.
Yeah, pretty much. You did have holes in the walls as well, so that he could watch them during their most intimate moments. And the girl that was in there, she was, I hate to talk about 15-year-olds in this way, but she was sexually active. So there was a very high chance that he watched her during these acts of intimacy. But that's gross. Yeah.
And she was the one that she broke up with him.
Yeah, they went on 2 dates.
Okay.
She felt sorry for him basically, and then she just ended things. And she thought she'd seen the last of him, but he was still there, watching her all along. Gross. Yeah, it's not nice.
So with this case, right? Every time I look up information for it, for the most part, I see the same regurgitated information over and over again, and sometimes the facts change, right? I mean, it's hard to nail down the facts of this case if you just listen to, a random podcast episode, or you even look on whatever, website that tries to collect all the facts. And you hear things from, he dressed up like the mother, or he dressed like a ninja. You hear all kinds of crazy things. And, the names of people involved in the case are different from each source you read. And it makes it really hard to get accurate information. So that's the thing, right? Like for me, I can't find enough information about the case because there isn't enough information.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does this happen where all the facts are misconstrued and you don't know what's real?
Well, that's still a problem to this day. Like I've been researching the case for probably 5 years now, and I still come across conflicting reports. How it started, I really don't know, because I've got newspapers from 1987 when his crimes were first reported. And it's kind of a peculiarity of the case in that, like, when he stalked these girls and lived in their home, I should mention there's more than one girl that he stalked. There were 3 sisters in this house. And that was in 1986. And everyone involved were all underage. They were, Danny was 15, Tina was 15, and the other girls were 15 and 9. So everyone involved was underage. So they couldn't report their real names in the newspaper because they were all minors. So basically nothing was reported at the time. It was all kept very, very hush-hush. Like, it's weird because I recently spoke to Dan's sister, and she had no idea that Dan had done this. Like, she knew nothing about it. Even to this day, she knew nothing about it, which is very, very strange. But it wasn't reported at the time. So,
what do you mean she didn't know anything about it?
she knew Dan was a murderer, but she didn't know Dan had stalked these girls in their house. She still didn't know to this day. I was the one that told
That's
her about it, which
that's
is very
wild.
weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she was a bit older than Dan. She was like, I think she was 6 years older than Dan. And she'd moved out of the house by the time Dan had done this.
Okay.
But she was like, what the hell? I have no idea what you're talking about. So I was the one that had to tell her the weird stuff that her brother had done. So, but that just shows that when it happened at the time, it wasn't reported anywhere. It wasn't a big local news story. No one of the people involved really knew about it, and maybe like schoolyard rumours and stuff like that. So it wasn't until a year later, when Dan committed murder, that what had happened a year before was finally reported, if that makes sense. Like they
Yeah.
would
Wow.
preface the stories by saying, "Oh, a year ago in 1986, Dan also stalked this home," to kind of give an intro to make it kind of a more sensational news story, So they say, "Oh, a year ago he stalked these girls, and now this year he's committed murder," and that was the time when it was first reported, and when people started learning about it outside of Dan's close friends and the people involved, stuff like that. So by that point, the facts had been a little bit jumbled. And I think they were interviewing some of the officers that were there at the time, and some of the officers, their memories, you can distort events quite easily in the span of a year. And plus, at the local precinct, officers will have talked, things will have evolved and mutated, information will have changed, and the journalists were getting their information from them. So it wasn't completely accurate information. And I think that's where the misinformation started, because like you say, there's reports of Dan being dressed as a ninja, dressed in a wedding dress, dressed as an Indian. He had face paint on, but he wasn't particularly dressed like anything, no notable character. He just had face paint on and his hair gelled up. That's really where it starts. And I think that's just continued to this day. I mean, those were the only real solid resources people could use. And I think more imaginative writers and stuff like that have added their own flourishes to the story over the years. And now it's almost impossible to discern what's real and what's not. But luckily, I've managed to get it from the people involved, and I trust that their memories are accurate. Although, again, there are a few conflicting reports. Like the two officers that found Dan, they both have conflicting stories about where he was found. So it's like, oh man, which one do I believe? So you just have to kind of go with the majority, really. And like, if other people say, oh, he was found behind a washing machine or behind a fridge, and then that's what you have to go with. But yeah, that's kind of how I've managed to separate the truth from the fiction.
Why do you think there's so many inaccurate things about this case? It seems to change historically, but also within the different people that you've spoken to. So just curious, I mean, what's your theory?
It's a tough one, because I think some of it comes down to the memory of the people involved. Like, I hate to generalize, but we're dealing with 70, 80-year-old people here. So their memories of what happened 35 years ago are not going to be completely coherent. But then again, nothing to do with age, really. I mean, because we've all got false memories. We think we remember stuff in detail from 20 years ago, but when we see pictures of it, it's not quite as what we remembered. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many inconsistencies. But I think also it's because it's like, if this was a fiction story, you could have so many different angles to run with. You could really embellish certain parts to make it really horrific. And I think that's what a lot of people have done. Because I read articles from sort of like about 15 years ago, before true crime had become a real staple of the internet. I mean, before there were like millions of podcasts and millions of websites and blogs dedicated to true crime. And I think people thought that they could add a couple of details and no one would notice. Because, I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. I mean, I did it. I've done it a few times, but back in the day. So I think that's what people did. They just kind of added their own little highlights to it, just to make the story more fascinating to readers. And they hoped no one would ever check the sources to kind of to put them together. So that's my personal theory. It could be wrong. It could just be, a strange phenomenon, because there's millions of true crime cases with complete misinformation in them as well. And I think it's the lack of sources, people's memories, and authors just wanting to kind of add a little bit of their own flavour to it.
I mean, it's kind of like the stuff of like legend and folklore, right? It's almost like this. It can become an urban legend in a way because when you don't know all of the
Yeah,
facts,
yeah,
that's kind of how urban legends go, right? I mean, there's the real story, and then over time things get added to it and switched
yeah.
around and molded in a certain way, and now it becomes something else. It becomes larger than the true and real events that actually took place.
That could be what it is. Yeah, I mean, people just wanted to blow the myth up and make it more legendary and like a folklore story. I mean, New England has no shortage of folklore stories, so this is
That's true.
yeah, it
Yeah.
fits in really well with the whole witch culture and stuff like that, and the supernatural Lovecraftian world.
Yeah,
So
it
that could be
does.
what it
Yeah.
was. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts in itself, there's so many different,
absolutely.
things in history that are like that. And yeah, really, it could be anything that could lead to the misinformation and the different stories that everybody has in this case, for sure.
Very much so. Absolutely. But yeah, Massachusetts is a weird place. It's well, I did some digging recently, and I found out that the town that Danny was from was originally cursed by a witch back in the 1700s. So it's little things like that that kind of make you think, hey, hang on. I don't believe in
It's
any of that stuff, but
it's
it's just
it's
nice to.
funny. There's so many like little towns and little places that are like cursed by a witch in the 17 or 1600s. It's really funny.
Yeah, I'm sure it never happened. It's just nice to think about. But,
How do you
yeah.
find that kind of information? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, you have to really dig into people's memories. I mean, I couldn't have done this without the help of the Townsend locals. I mean, they've been really nice to me. But 99% of them have been really nice to me. And they've told me all these kinds of these little stories. And the witch thing was one of them. But yeah, it's all very niche folklore stuff that you wouldn't find just Googling it. You'd have to really dig into people's consciousness to get to the. But that's been the fun part of all the all the research. Really, it's been like I say, it's great to uncover information that's just locked inside people's heads and get it out there. That's one of the reasons why I do it. So yeah, that's been the best part.
So your
Yeah,
sources are the people who have been directly involved with the case or have been affected by
yeah,
LaPlante.
yeah, absolutely everybody. Yeah, there's been. Oh, if I could, I mean, there must be. I counted a few weeks ago, and there were 86 people I interviewed that had all had connection to LaPlante in some way. The most important ones were the girls that he stalked. I mean, they've become pretty good friends of mine now. Well, two of them have. One of them doesn't like me for some reason.
Wow.
The officers that yeah, I won't go into that. The officers that arrested Danny, they've been very open with me, very kind. I mean, they were the ones that started it all because they said they hadn't really talked about this case for 35 years since it happened because it's so horrific. I mean, child murder, it's horrible, it's tragic. So they've kept it kind of locked away for 3 decades. But they were very nice enough to open up their hearts and memories to me. Look, Danny's family have been good to me. He's had a lot of childhood friends that have reached out to me. I've become good friends with a few of them myself. There were a lot of girls that I hate to say sexually assaulted because he just used to kind of grope them around town and stuff like that. He used to kind of, at parks and parties, he'd kind of, give them a little, I'd say because it's horrible, but yeah, he used to kind of violate them in ways they didn't want to be. They've all been very open about their trauma. There was one woman in particular that Danny did full on rape, and she's been, I couldn't believe it because she reached out to me out of the blue because I was searching for this woman for years to try and find her. And because again, I talked to the people and they'd all said, "Oh, you want to talk to this girl because she was raped by Dan." And I tried to search for her for so long and I couldn't find her. And then one day I just got an email from her and she contacted me, which is really, really strange. And she was been great to me. She shared her story in all its horrible details. And then there was even the other side of the case, which take place after the murders. I've talked to some of the jurors, Danny's defending lawyer, trying to get hold of the district attorney at the time. Who else was there? Oh, there was a woman that Danny abducted, and she's been very helpful to me as well. So yeah, there's not a single component of the case that I haven't been able to cover from someone's personal recollection. So that's how it all came together so well, really.
I mean, that's amazing that you were able to get in touch with and get a hold of this many people in regards to this case.
It's been really weird, yeah. A lot of them have come to me as well, so I'm very grateful for that. Sometimes I'd wake up with a message in my inbox and I was, oh yeah, I need to know that, and so okay, amazing. Yeah, it's been really good.
Why do you think they come to you?
Well, that's something that I've been racking my brain over, because at least 6, maybe no, 7 people involved in this case have all said to me, I haven't spoken about this for 35 years. I've never spoken to anyone about this. One of the girls that Danny stalked, there were 3 of the girls. There were Tina, Kathy, and Karen. And Kathy's become a really good friend of mine. And when she first reached out to me, she said, I haven't mentioned this to anyone, even my family. Nobody knows that this happened to me
Wow.
35 years ago. This has never left my lips in over 3 decades. So I was like, oh my God, okay. And that got me thinking, why now? Why have they only just come to me? And honestly, I don't know. Because you think the answer them, I don't know. I think it's because, well, for one, it's become clear that Danny's never getting out of prison. He's going to stay in there till the day he is. And it's been up in the air for a few years because he's had a lot of parole hearings and he's been messing with the police. So there was always this fear that he might get lucky and maybe get out. But it's become clear it's not going to happen. So I think everyone's a little more reassured that they're safe from him.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's one part of it. Another reason is, I don't know. I'm really trying to rack them up. I mean, have you got any theories why some people might only talk about it after 35 years? And it's weird because they've all started talking about it at the same time. They've all, in the past year, these 7 people have all been openly discussing about it. And people have tried to find them in the past and they've all said no. Like the girls involved, they've been contacted by film companies, production companies to make films about it, and they've all said no, I don't want to talk about it. But they've all talked to me, and I don't understand why. Maybe it's my Britishness that they just can't resist. I don't know.
It could be your approach to analyzing the case, possibly. You do seem to have a big passion for trying to get the facts and get the story straight, and that might be what interests them.
Yeah, it could be, I guess. But so a few people have told me to get lost, and I don't blame them. I fully expected a lot more people to say, no, I'm not talking about this, go away. But the key elements of the case have all been very, very responsive to me. But you're right, maybe it could be the way I always approach them with respect, and I always, I never hound anyone. If they say no, then it's no. One of the girls involved, she said she didn't want her name involved in my book, so I've had to kind of take her out. But yeah, I've got to respect these things because it's their trauma, and it's not my place to try and profit off it. It's their stories, so I understand that. So yeah, it could be that, but really, I don't know. It just maybe everyone's just realised now is the time to talk about it. If they don't talk about it now, maybe they never will. I mean, a lot of them are getting old, like into their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even. So maybe it's that, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes they just need to actually express that and get it off of their chest. They've been keeping it close to their chest for so long that they just need to talk about it.
Yeah.
It could also help that you are, I'm sure the people that have contacted them are also outsiders, but you are across the pond, you're from a different culture. I wonder if that makes a difference. But also the fact that you just don't seem to have an exploitative nature and they reached out to you, right? I would be more suspicious if somebody was reaching out to me because I had something traumatic happen. I mean, have you thought about asking them?
Asking who?
Asking your sources. Maybe when the time is right. Why did you?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, that's the thing. I didn't want to say, I did think about asking a few of them, saying, why have you contacted me now? But I thought it might make them a little bit hesitant, I thought they might get offended or something, like they're spilling their heart to me and I'm saying, what are you talking to me for? So I didn't want to go down that route, but since I've become friends with quite a lot of them, I probably will ask them at some point and say, listen, what's the deal? Why talk about it now? Yeah, so maybe I will.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we do, like it helps to make our guests feel comfortable. We always try to approach it in a way that's we're sensitive to, whatever their trauma or whatever their experience has been and try not to exploit it. And then we do definitely try and ask, why are you telling us your story? And they're usually really receptive and they answer truthfully and they're usually really good about it.
No, that's good. I mean, I always think how I'd feel if somebody reached out to me if I'd been involved in trauma, and I think I'd be a little bit upset. I think I'd be kind of offended, but I don't know. I'm not in that position, so I've never been in that position, so I don't know. I can't put myself in their shoes. But no, maybe I'll just have to ask them one day once I've got the courage.
I mean, everybody's different too. Some people may not want to actually. You got to feel it out.
Yeah, true. True. Yeah.
Speaking of your sources/friends, how do you feel about that relationship? How do you feel about the relationships you've forged with them? I
Um,
imagine you have more of a duty to do justice.
well, in all the cases, it's kind of gone past. We don't just talk about Dan and stuff like that anymore. We don't just talk about the crimes. We talk about everything we can. I've connected with everyone on a level outside of crime. So there's always that human element. And I think that's why one of the reasons they've been so responsive to me since I've become friends with them. Because I don't just message them when I need them and ask them about, oh, can you just tell me what happened in this bit? I talk to Kathy, one of the girls, like every week. Like she calls me all the time. And we never really talk about what happened to her. We talk about everything else. So I just feel like it's a normal, friendly relationship, really. Like I'd talk to these people anyway, even if they weren't involved in what happened. But again, like you say, I do feel I have a duty to tell their stories properly, and I would never want. Like I'd hate them for them to read my book and say, "Oh well, I never said that. Oh well, that's not true. Oh well, he's lied about that. He's embellished that." That would be the worst thing I think I could do, and that would really bother me. So yeah, you're right. I do feel I have a duty to tell it properly and to kind of show them respect because they've respected me by telling them their story.
Speaking of your book, curious. I don't know if this is something that you want to go into all that much, just because it's
Yeah,
not
sure.
out yet. And so I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, how did you sort of structure your book? Do you start at the beginning of Danny's sort of like criminal activities, or
Yeah.
do you just delve right into the case of the
We
murders?
we go right back to the start, right back to everything, because I think that's what people really will really connect with. They like I remember I opened with a scene from the murder case because I thought that's the thing that kind of grabs people, and that's one of the reasons why most people will read it to hear about that part. But I've also gone right back to the start from day one. Like I've talked about his mom and his dad and how they met, even his grandparents and how they were like strict, devoutly religious and all this kind of stuff. How they first met in Maine and then moved to Massachusetts, and then right from Danny's birth in the hospital to his when he was talk about when he was a child, so he was 4. Then we go to his teenage years, and then like it's probably not until the last third that we start talking about the crimes really. So yeah, I've covered pretty much everything and kind of set the scene and then gone through it chronologically.
I like that because it kind of gives you a real sense of his background, his family
Yeah,
background, and everything that he went through himself too.
exactly. I want to try and kind of, I mean, I try and kind of explain why he did what he did because I think there is kind of weird reasons that some people will be able to grasp. I mean, to the rational person, they can't because child murder is, it's beyond comprehension, understandably. But I think if you kind of explain his violent upbringing and how he was raised in those conditions, it can help people understand why he became the monster that he did.
On that note, do you understand why he became the monster he did? And yeah.
No, not really at all. I mean, lots of people go through the same thing
Right.
he did, and don't become anything like what he did. But Dan was kind of the perfect storm of circumstances, really. I mean, he had a very violent father. He had no sort of male figure in his life. His mother was very doting and kind of believed him and naive. So he had these kind of two polarizing extremes. He had an abusive father and a mother that thought he was like a golden child. So he was kind of always pulled between these two extremes. And then when you combine it with the fact he was basically born to be a monster. He was child onset type B, I believe is the psychiatric term, which means no amount of rehabilitation or intervention could have stopped him from becoming what he did. He was always going to have these violent sexual tendencies. And as a teenager, he became kind of addicted to pornography. So he had all these psychological components pulling away at his brain and his outlook on life. And all that descended into the fact he was compelled to commit murder. So no, I don't understand it myself, because I think even if you had these urges, you should know that you don't cross that line. You don't cross the line into rape, into abuse, into murder, and especially not into child murder. I mean, it's kind of weird because if you look at Dan like a serial killer, you can kind of understand why he why he stalked a woman his age and why he murdered a woman that was a bit older than him, because they were in his kind of sexual demographic. But then when he goes to an underage girl and underage boy, he just becomes like, what the hell? Why would he even do this? So no, I can't really understand why he did what he did. Maybe a better psychiatrist than me could, but no, I don't.
I don't know if they would be able to.
Yeah, because
I don't think
it
so.
seems like you said, you have different, like, I mean, yeah, a serial killer sort of has like a type, right? They have like generally
Yeah.
like what they usually, their usual victims. But yeah, here you have children, you have a mother, you have, stalking. It seems kind of random.
His victimology is not consistent at all. It was
Right.
4 completely different demographics. But I mean, the reason he murdered the children is because they were in his way.
Right.
But I think, yeah, I mean, you know what I'm going to say. It's over the line, and he should have been more. And again, another factor is that he was 17 years old at the time, and of course, your brain is not fully developed. You don't really understand the consequences of the things you're going to do. I mean, some 17-year-olds might, but a lot of them wouldn't. So there's that factor as well to throw in there. So yeah, it was a whole tornado of different problems that caused him to do what he did.
Because we know that he had these problems, intervention probably would not have worked, right? In terms of, but was there any efforts to sort of intervene in his life when he's doing these terrible things, making these really bad decisions and harming
No,
people?
the only intervention he had was after he was found stalking the Bowen girls. He went to a psychiatric ward for 9 months, a juvenile detention center for 9 months, and then his mum posted bail. And from that point, it became a kind of a real battle between the juvenile system and the cops, because remember the cop that caught Danny, he told me that he took 6 mugshots of him when he was first taken into the cells, even though he was supposed to take 2, because he said he knew he'd be using those mugshots in the future again. So he could sort of instinctively tell Danny was going to be back there at some point. And the officer Tom Lane, he kind of pushed for Danny to be trialed as an adult for the stalking that he did. This wasn't a murder case, something he did. But he wasn't tried at all for anything.
At
But
all?
yeah, no, well, because he committed murder when he came out, that kind of overruled what he did
Yeah, it's true.
before.
Yeah.
Everything else just went by the wayside, and he was only trialed for the murders. But these officers, they said, look, this kid is bad news. He's been a deviant in the town for years and years. This is just the start of his reign of terror. And of course, I hate to say, they had no real evidence for it as such, because, he was a teenage delinquent, just like many other people in the town. I mean, yeah, he'd gone one step a bit too far and stalked these girls, but didn't indicate to the courts that he could be a potential murderer. Even though, but then the cops, they've got they can sense human nature, can't they? They can read people. Maybe the courts couldn't. They're more by the books and, strict. So it became a kind of bone of contention between the courts and the cops, because they really wanted to push Danny for harsher punishments and to ideally keep him locked up for life, because they knew he would cause more trouble, and he did. So yeah, it's still a kind of a sore subject with some of the people involved today. They still say, if they'd have tried Danny as an adult during the stalking, he wouldn't have done what he did. So yeah, they kind of tried, but not to the extent they could. But it depends on your view. I mean, a lot of people would have done things differently. This court just happened to not do it that way. So I think maybe if it happened in another state, it would have been a different story. But we don't know.
Obviously, you've done a lot of work on the LaPlante case, and I'm sure there are things that interest you beyond that. So
Yeah.
what else are you up to?
After the LaPlante case, I'm doing a book on. I do a lot of work with Japanese murderers, Asian murderers. And the one case I'm really getting involved in now is the case of a guy called Takahiro Shiraishi. You've ever heard of him? He was like a teenager who lured people into his apartment and then made them kill themselves. It was a really fascinating case in Japan. He's just been given execution, a death
Wow.
sentence. So I'm looking into that because it's really weird, and there's so many questions to it that he just brings up just by that little piece of information there. He lured people and made them kill themselves.
Yeah, I need to know more. Like that's immediately.
Well, Japan has a interesting history of kind of having like group suicide.
Like going into the forest and what is it? That like forest where people go to.
Yeah, I don't know how, but I mean the case that you're working on, Joe, is interesting.
Yeah, seppuku it's called. But yeah, a lot of suicides in Japan. There's it's the second highest suicide rate in the world after is it Hong Kong's the most or Thailand? It's some other Asian place. But yeah, it's the second highest rate in the world because their working conditions are just so harsh. And there's a big emphasis on kind of collectivity, and you need to fit in with the collective rather than the individual. So people that don't identify with the collective group that are left on the outskirts, they kind of get drawn towards a life of depression, anxiety, and then eventually suicide. That's why it's so common over there. But it's unlike, I can't remember the other country that's the highest rate. But the contrast is in the country where it's the highest, it's the living conditions and the squalor, like the third world aspect of it. But in Japan, it's much different. It's the socio-economic factors that drive people to suicide. Again, it's like kind of like a plant. There's not much information in the Western world about these strange cases that happen in the East. So I like to kind of put them together so the West can learn all these horrific details as well.
Yeah, I love the strange cases. Those are, I always love research and find like just the strangest things.
What's your research process like? How does it differ from a journalist? And I wonder if that's also one reason why you're more approachable.
I've never thought about this question. My research process is to just kind of compile it all in a big Word document and try and put their notes in the correct place so that when I look back at it, it's all in a chronological order. So that's the only approach that I've ever used, is to just record what people tell me, transcribe it somewhere, and then try and see if it matches with what other people have told me, and then try and slot it into my master file of information and see if it fits and see if everything else is on board with it. But yeah, I've never thought about that before. I just dive right in and hope for the best, to be honest.
So you're kind of like your own detective.
Yeah, I guess I am. I've never thought of it like that. Dive right in and let it sort itself out, I guess. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I didn't think you'd have one. I think you just kind of find people and interview and see where it goes from there, I guess. I've never gone in with a game plan. I've always just gone in and winged it. Like, I've never had questions planned or anything like that. I'm just kind of, like, I talked to Dan's sister for the first time last week. And before, I didn't even think about it before I dived in. I just called her and thought, I'll just wing it and see what comes out the other side. And it came out pretty great, so couldn't complain.
Sometimes that's the best.
Maybe that's the trick. Just dive in, don't think about it, don't think too much, don't overthink things, just get in and start talking.
Just do it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, just do it. Shut up and do it.
How do you think your experience with the case or your rapport with the sources would have changed if you were in the US? Is that something that you've thought about?
If I was in the US, I'd be tempted to visit them in person. Would that get a better result? I don't know. I mean, I've got a friend in Townsend who does that kind of thing for me. Like, he goes and talks to people that I've, become acquainted with to give the kind of personal touch. So I think that would be the major difference if I was over there. But like you say, that could be a negative, because people might be more, maybe it's the fact that I'm different and alien, that people are willing to talk to me, because it's kind of like there's a barrier kind of thing. Like, they're not talking to their neighbour who's going to tell everyone else in the town. They're talking to someone miles away who they've got no mutual acquaintances with. So maybe it would have been a detriment. I don't know. I have to think about that one. I don't know.
What would you want to ask him if you ever met him?
That's a good question.
I think the first question
I,
should be, would you want to meet him?
That too.
yeah, I would. I know he'd lie to me because he tends to lie a lot. So, first of all, I'd say I'd want to ask him why he did what he did. I don't think he'd tell me the truth. Although, then again, he did. Like, I talked to a guy that was in prison with Dan, and he said Dan was very open about what he did, and he just said, "I did it because I liked it." So maybe I'd talk about that with him. But really,
Yeah.
I'd want to talk about his childhood and how he think it affected him. I really want to talk to him about his dad because I think his dad is one of the reasons why he became what he did. So I'd really want to delve into that kind of life because I don't think he's ever really talked about it to anyone. So first of all I'd try and zone in on that part of his life, and then I'd want to ask him the hows and whys of how he managed to stalk the sisters. Because again, I think I've got all the answers, but there might be something that I'm not aware of. And then I would have to ask him. I'd say, why did you kill two innocent children? So yeah, that's all I'll have to ask him. And then I don't think he'd tell me the truth. I think he'd just come up with some lame excuse. But that's all I could think of asking him, really. I know everything else.
You do.
Yeah, I feel like if you can get him to trust you, maybe he can open up enough. But
I've tried to. I've emailed him loads of times. I've talked to him via proxy through his mom and someone else in his prison, but I've never talked directly to him. He doesn't get many visitors, and he's not really the social type, as you can imagine. And he's obviously very depressed and stuff because he spent his entire adult life in jail. I mean, he's been there since he was like 18, and he's 49 now, I think.
this is fun. I enjoyed it.
This was fun. Yeah.
This was fun. Thank you.
Thank you so
for
much.
having me. Thank you for having me. And I can't wait to listen to the episode. Is it going to be out tomorrow? I hope.
Yeah, tomorrow. We work quickly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time.
We'd like to thank Joe Turner for being on the show today. It was great talking to him about the Danny LaPlante case, learning the ins and the outs, and how he leveraged relationships with people who have been affected by the case personally.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Bound by the Cloak.
To learn more about Joe Turner, check out his website, joeturnerbooks.com. Look out for Joe's book, The Boy in the Walls, coming soon.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.
See you next time.